I do pray that is the prayer of all of our hearts. You know the way through the wilderness. All we have to do is follow. Help us to keep our eyes on you, author and finisher of our faith. This morning, bless our pastor as he opens your word. We pray in Jesus' name, and all of God's children said, amen. Thank you. You may be seated.
If you look around our world, maybe if you look around your neighborhood, maybe if you look around your life, it doesn't take us very long to notice that things are broken. Some weeks in ministry, and this has been at least part of one, you almost hate to answer the phone because it seems like every phone call brings some kind of bad news. And maybe you felt that way this week, or maybe you felt that way recently. Certainly as you look at the political realm and you look at what's going on in our country or even around the world, and you have to say, how in the world did we get this messed up? How did we get this broken? If you look at the financial realm, the stock market's up, and then it's down, and then it's up, and then it's down, and you wonder, is there a bubble? And if so, when's the bubble going to burst? And then, as I mentioned earlier, many of us over this week have been battling colds and other kinds of things that are going around, and that just reminds us that this is a world that is broken, that sickness and disease and, as we've been reminded with Ross Gregory's death, even death come into our world. And there's no area that's exempt. Over the last several weeks, talking to friends, hearing about struggles in churches and churches that are wrestling with issues or fighting with each other, and you think, is everything broken? And the reality is, the answer is yes, sin has touched every realm of our lives. And yet here we are, and we're walking with God, and we're trying to walk with God rightly in a broken world. So what does that look like? How do you respond if you're walking with God to the brokenness that is around us? Does walking with God mean that we stick our heads in the sand? That we ignore the needs of our world? That we ignore the needs of our country? We ignore the needs of our neighborhood? We saw earlier that Abram, as we see him now, Hebrews tells us, was looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. So does that mean that he was just apathetic to what was happening? Should a Christian be involved in his community or her community? Should a Christian be engaged in politics? Should a Christian be engaged in social justice issues? Should a Christian go to war? All of those kinds of questions come to us because we live in a world that is not the way God designed it. It's a broken world. And when we come to Genesis chapter 14, we begin to see some answers to those kinds of questions. Not to all of them, but at least some parameters for us. As we see a side of Abram that we have not seen before. As we see something about his life that is unique and that we haven't noticed. Because now war comes to the land of Canaan. Imagine that, war in the Middle East. There's a novel topic, right? This is actually the first war that is mentioned in the Bible. It's not the first war in human history. In fact, some of the earliest artifacts that we have from human history, the earliest pictures, portray battles and wars. It's common to fallen, broken man. But now it comes for the first time in the Bible into the land of Canaan, into the land of promise. How are God's people going to respond? As we unpack a rather complicated chapter this morning, what we're going to notice is that walking with God doesn't mean we're isolated from our broken world. Walking with God does not mean that even though we are looking for the city of God, we are looking for and anticipating heaven, it doesn't mean we ignore what's happening on earth. And we see that in Abram's life as he is caught up in the midst of the brokenness of his world. The reality is that events around us do impact us. We may be citizens of heaven first and foremost, and if you're a follower of Christ, you are. But we are also citizens of a country here. And what happens here in this country, what happens in our world, does have an impact on us. In the beginning of chapter 14, we get background information. The first 4 verses tell us that 14 years before these events unfolded, there was a coalition of kings. And some of you are saying, "Ooh, I can't wait to hear the pastor read these names." You're not going to. I can pronounce these names, but I can't do it standing in front of people. There's just something about standing up here. I'll pronounce a few of them as we go through, but I want you to look at those first 4 verses and notice the background. You've got a coalition of 4 kings from the area of Mesopotamia, from the area that would today be Iraq and Iran and Turkey, that have dominated the Middle East. They've dominated the land of promise. And for 12 years, the people in the Jordan Valley and in Palestine have been paying tribute to these 4 kings, to their empire. But now, 12 years into it, they rebel. And they refuse to send tribute any longer. And in the 13th year, a war campaign begins that by the 14th year brings its consequences into the land of promise. These 4 kings invade. And critical to our thinking is to remember what they are invading. They are invading the land that God has promised to Abram. The first thing they do is they sweep down through what later would be known as the King's Highway on the other side of the Jordan River. And as they sweep through there, if you follow the verses 5 and following, you'll see they conquer one kingdom after another, including the Rephites, which were the giants that lived in the land when Israel comes later into this land. So they are having a very successful military campaign. We don't know the names of any of these kings or their kingdoms from secular archaeological finds, but what we do know is that right in this time period, there was devastation brought to this area that caused it to not be rebuilt for a few centuries afterwards. Probably the devastation of this attack. These kings then sweep south of the land of promise. Ooh, that's bad. I think I need a kill switch on here. They sweep south of the land, conquering the Amalekites and the Amorites. And then finally, they move into the Jordan Valley. And when they come into the Jordan Valley, the 4 kings now are facing 5 kings. 5 kings of city-states. Don't think kings of massive nations. They're just small city-states. And these 5 kings are on their home turf. And they're going to fight the 4 kings. They're rebelling against the 4 kings. But in spite of the fact that these 4 kings have been on a long military campaign, in spite of the fact that the 5 kings are on their home turf, the 5 kings lose. And they are defeated. Their armies routed. And the kings sack the cities. And you say, okay, well, that's a nice history lesson. So what? What in the world does this have to do? Why in the world is this in the Bible? Why do we need to know this? Well, because in verses 10 and 11, we begin to transition into why it's important. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, tar pits. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell, not the kings, but their forces, fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their provisions and went their way. And you're still thinking, so what? Verse 11, they took also Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were the allies of Abram. So conflict has come to Abram's world. Brokenness is evident here. How's he going to respond? How might you have responded? He could have said, well, you know what? This is not my fight. They didn't invade the hill country where I am. They've left me alone. They may not even know I'm here. I'll just sit it out. He could have said, nobody else has stood in their way. Even the giants didn't stand in their way. I think I'll sit it out. He could have said, well, Lot's just getting what he deserves. After all, what he did to me, and did you notice? He's moved into Sodom now. Lot's living in that wicked city. He's just getting what he deserves. He could have said, well, you know what? God is in control of it all. I'll just wait and see what God does. Those are all responses that people throughout history, even God's people throughout history, have had as they looked at the world's brokenness. But I want us to notice in this story that the world's brokenness calls for us to impact. Even though Abram is a man of faith, even though he is walking with God, he is not isolated from his world. There's a lot that we don't know about Abram. Verse 14 shows us one thing. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and they went in pursuit as far as Dan. For a minute. This guy has 318 soldiers. Who is he? Really? 318 that have been born in his household. So his household is big enough that he has 318 men who have grown up in his larger household who have been trained to fight. Abram's a warlord. Not only that, if you go back to verse 13, he has allies who are warlords. Mamre and Eshcol and Aner. And Abram takes his men, and his allies go with him. And they follow this army that no one has beaten to this point. That takes courage. And they leave where they are in Hebron, around the oaks of Mamre, and they travel some 120 miles to the north before they finally catch up with this enemy army. They are at the area that will later be known as Dan. They are at the northernmost boundary of the land of promise. And there, Abram wisely divides his forces. And he attacks. And we'll read that in just a moment. But I want you to think about what was going through Abram's mind. Why is he engaged? Why is he helping a broken man named Lot and other broken people in this broken world when he could have sat it out? can I suggest to you that Abram is doing that because he understands that Lot is not the only one who's broken? He's not the only one who's been impacted by a broken world. That Abram remembers that it was God who reached down and plucked him out of his brokenness in Ur of the Chaldees and called him to himself. That Abram remembers how in his brokenness he went down into Egypt and he lied about who Sarai was and ended up in a mess, and God reached down into Egypt and rescued him out of his brokenness. And now he looks and he sees Lot in deep trouble, and he says, if God has rescued me, how in the world can I not reach out and minister to my nephew? And I think it's important for us, as we walk in a broken world, that we remember that it's not just the world that's broken, we're broken too. That we are walking in our own brokenness, and the extent to which we are healing is not because of who we are, but because of who God is, because of what God has done in our lives. And so we engage with people who are broken. And we as a church engage in ministries like the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission or Alternatives of Kalamazoo. And people would say, well, some of those folks have made really bad choices. Yeah, they're broken. And so are we. And if we're going to walk in a broken world, we need to understand that we can't be isolated from it, because God's working on our brokenness as well. Abram didn't approve of Lot's lifestyle. He didn't approve of Lot's choices, but he loved Lot. And so he engaged in battle in the world. Then he does it very wisely. He divides his forces against them, verse 15, by night. He and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Habnah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. So Abram pursues them, defeats them, chases them, in essence chases them right out of the promised land to north of Damascus, almost saying, get out of my land and stay out. And those 4 kings flee. You say, well, how in the world did he do it when nobody else could? Well, number one, they were very self-confident. They had swept all the opposition. In fact, smart military strategy on their part. They had come down that eastern shore and defeated all the enemies there. They'd come across the south, made sure there would be no enemies behind them, and then they attacked Sodom. They think everybody that's a threat is gone. Abram attacks at night when they're not expecting it. But ultimately we say, how do Abram and his 318 men plus his allies, however that numbered, how do they beat a superior force? God. Because Abram was engaging in the world in a way that God wanted him to do. And God gives him a great victory. And we learn from what we're seeing that walking with God, because that's what Abram's doing, doesn't mean that we are isolated from our broken world. When I was growing up, and Pastor Steve will remember this, and some of you who have been around as long as we have or longer will remember, there was a time within our Bible-believing circles when people said, politics is dirty business, don't get involved in that. You don't want, just preach the gospel. Don't worry about all the things that are going on, just preach the gospel. Now listen to me very closely. The gospel is the greatest need that our world has. They need to know Christ. But that doesn't mean we ignore all the other needs too. There are times when we have to minister to other needs to gain a hearing for the gospel. There are also times when we just have to minister to those other needs because people are broken. And because we care, because God cares. We ought to be concerned about the people around us and care for them as image bearers of God. That's why we as a church engage in things like our ministry at Haverhill Elementary School. That's why we march in the Memorial Day parade. That's why we do the highway cleanup. That's why we are involved in trunk or treat. It's why we did the carnival after Action Day camp. It's why we as pastors go and pray for the Portage City Council before their meetings when they invite us to. And a couple years ago before Kalamazoo's City Council. Because we live in a broken world. And we as God's people aren't isolated from that. That brokenness has been part of our lives and it still impacts us. And that means that brokenness calls for us to impact our world and to minister to our world in its brokenness with the gospel, but meeting other needs as well. That doesn't mean that we need a church program for every part of brokenness. Please, we don't need to add to the programs. But it may mean that you want to involve yourself and volunteer in an after-school program, or you want to volunteer at a food pantry, or to work with the homeless, or to reach out and minister to immigrants as they come to our country in the name of Christ, because our world is broken. Too often, we think ministry just happens within these walls, and it doesn't. Ministry means that you and I, as followers of Christ, engage with the brokenness where we see it. In the name of Christ, sharing the gospel of Christ, but meeting the needs, reaching out in the brokenness. We need to be involved. Story is told of a man who was a pretty good golfer who had a buddy who wasn't. That would be me. I am not a golfer. Don't invite me to go with you unless you want to spend a lot longer on the golf course than you usually do. But this buddy was really not very good. And he got up there at the first tee and he took this huge swing and the ball went about 20 feet down the fairway, actually off into the rough a little ways, and landed on top of an anthill. So he walked up there, looked at the ball, took a huge swing, missed the ball, hit the anthill. The ball pops up in the air, drops right back down on the anthill where there are now thousands of dead ants. So he steps back. Takes a big swing again, misses the ball, hits the anthill, the ball pops in the air, drops right back down on the anthill where all of the ants are dead except two. And the one ant looks at the other ant that's still alive and says, "Brother, if we're going to survive, we better get on the ball." I just felt like we needed a little levity in a heavy sermon about war. But the principle applies. If our broken world is going to survive, and we know that ultimately the Prince of Peace is coming, but in the meantime, we need to be involved. We need to get on the ball. And we need to serve God in the midst of the brokenness that is here because of what He has done for us. Walking with God doesn't mean we are isolated from our broken world. But the Bible is so wonderfully balanced. And some of you are wrestling with what I've talked about because we haven't heard the balance yet. Here's the balance in the story. Walking with God does mean we need discernment in our involvement. Because the danger is there that as we get involved, as we say, I don't want to be isolated, that we become absorbed, we become totally connected. And whatever we do, however we are involved, our desire must be for God's glory. And we see that coming out in the life of Abram here. Because the king of Sodom comes to meet Abram as Abram's on his way back from the battle. And the first question that comes to my mind is, wait a minute, how did this guy survive the battle? You know, did he go and hide when things were going badly? We don't know. But somehow he is still alive. And we read in verse 17, after that's Abram's, return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, then the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah, which is the king's valley. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." I want you to notice the gall of this guy. He ran and hid. Somehow he survived the battle. And his first word to Abram is a command. Give. You give me the people, you can keep all the rest of the stuff. Abram is being invited by the king of Sodom into a relationship of some sort. But notice what Abram says. Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High," El Elyon is the Hebrew name, "possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich." Abram refuses to take anything, not even a finder's fee. He had a right to it all. Certainly has a right to a reward. Many years ago when I was growing up in New Jersey, the church there was built of Jersey sandstone, big rocks. And in preparation for building an addition, which they ended up not using it for, they had accumulated a lot more of those rocks, and there was a big pile behind the church. My friends and I used to play on that pile. And one day as we were playing and we were shifting rocks or they moved, we found a wallet. And in that wallet, it was before the days of credit cards, there was still cash. And there was a driver's license, and so we turned it in, and the person got their wallet and their driver's license and their money back. And you know what they gave us? They gave us a reward. I don't remember how much it was. I remember I took it to the candy store, and probably didn't last long. But, we were being rewarded for what we had done. Abram deserves a reward. He deserves a finder's fee. But he says, I'm not going to take it because I am not going to be tied to the king of Sodom. I am not going to have anybody take away from the glory that is God's in this victory. I'm not going to have anybody say, the king of Sodom made Abram rich by giving him all of the booty from the conquest of the cities. He's holding high the glory of God. That's uppermost in his desire, in his goal. He says, the one exception is what my soldiers have eaten and what my allies will take as their share will keep. Verse 24, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and let the share of the men who went with me, let Aner and Eshcol and Mamre take their share. He's not going to bind these pagan warlords who were his allies to his standards, but he will not tie himself to the king of Sodom. And that's an important lesson for us. We cannot hitch our wagon to any political party or cause. Our desire should be for the glory of God. Sometimes we work with people in a political party, in a cause, but our desire is for God's glory, not a particular party or candidate. We ought to be praying for our political parties. We ought to be praying for our president. We ought to be praying for our governor. We ought to be praying for our mayors and our city council and our people who serve in government. But we cannot align ourselves so closely with them that people forget that God is our ultimate king and he is the one who gets the glory. But that's hard to do sometimes. So how do we do that? Well, let's continue on in the story and we'll see. Because before Abram meets the king of Sodom, he meets another king. And it's that meeting that enables him to have the right perspective. He meets a king in verse 18 by the name of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. There are 10 kings mentioned in this chapter, by the way. And this is the most unique of them all. His name means King of Righteousness. He is the ruler of Salem, or we know it later as Jerusalem. He is the King of Peace. And he is a priest of El Elyon, God Most High. Does that surprise you? Probably not, most of you, because you've read this story, you've heard about it. But if you are reading it for the first time, it should surprise you. Because all we know about what God is doing is caught up in the life of Abram. And yet here is this Canaanite king that is closer to God than Abram is. So much so that he is a priest, by the way, first mentioned in the Bible of a priest. And it's a non-Israelite priest. He is a priest of God Most High. And that is a great reminder to us that God is often at work in places that you and I aren't aware of. And all the commentators, everybody wants to know, so who is Melchizedek? And you can read all kinds of theories. I think Melchizedek is Melchizedek. It's just who he is. And he bursts on the scene here just to remind us that God is at work, but also to remind Abram who's in charge. Because if you read chapter 14 and you read through all those tough names and you read all the way through, you know what you will not find in the first 16 verses? Any reference to God. Now, I believe Abraham went into battle trusting God, but here we come into focus on who God is and what God has done. And that's important because sometimes in the euphoria of victory, we think we won the victory. Sometimes in the euphoria of something that God has done in our lives, we think we're pretty special. And Melchizedek comes along and reminds Abram who won the battle. And Melchizedek blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Abram, it wasn't because you were such a great military strategist. It wasn't because of the training your 318 men have. It wasn't because of your allies. Abram, it was God. And notice Abram's response. He gives a tenth, first mention of a tithe, to this king, to this priest. And that's how Abram was able to keep from being absorbed into the relationship with the king of Sodom. Because remember what he said to that king? "I have lifted my hand to God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." First time that title is used is in this passage. Where does Abram learn that name for God? From Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? He's Melchizedek. But those of you who are familiar with Hebrews know that he is also a picture. He's a picture of Jesus. That's what the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 7 says. You can go and read that for yourself this afternoon on your own time, because I'm respecting your time here this morning by not going there. But he's a type of Christ as a king and a priest. And here's the lesson. We maintain a desire for God's glory by meeting with Jesus. As we engage in our world, as we work with the people and the difficult situations and the brokenness, we need to make sure we're meeting with Jesus, or we'll get off center. We'll forget that our ultimate desire is God's glory, not simply healing of brokenness, not people patting us on the back for our engagement and our work with people. Abram won the first victory over the kings because God was with him. He won the second victory over the king of Sodom because Jesus had met with him. Oh, no, I don't think it's literally Jesus. Some people do, and it's possible, but I think it's just a man, but he represents Jesus as he reminds Abram what needs to be central in his life is the glory of God. And as you trace the story out, and as we'll look further into it in coming weeks, Lot sees the victory and goes right back to the brokenness of Sodom. Abram goes back to the altar at Hebron. And friends, that's what we've got to do. We've got to continue that relationship with God through Jesus Christ, because walking with God means we need discernment as we walk in this broken world. There should not be, and I'm not talking about what you have to identify for the laws of the state of Michigan, but in our thinking there should not be an R or a D in front of our names. We are not primarily Republicans or Democrats. We are followers of Jesus. And that means sometimes we say that party's wrong, sometimes we say that party's wrong, a lot of the time we say both parties are wrong, and we say what I'm concerned about is the glory of Christ, the glory of God. Our ultimate allegiance is to Him alone. And it can be hard for us to sort all of that out sometimes. I got to be honest with you, as I've looked at this whole thing with the president's edict about immigration, and I've looked at people on both sides that I respect saying different things, I've thought, Lord, I don't know. But my loyalty's to you, and whatever you want me to do, that's what I'll do. And that's got to be the desire and the call of our heart. We've got to be in this word. We've got to gather for corporate worship. We've got to listen to each other and what God is saying to one another. And we've got to pray for those who are in authority over us. And we've got to thank God for people like Margaret O'Brien or Tanya Shootmaker or Lieutenant Governor Brian Kelly, who are believers, who are trying to do this in the midst of the mess that is our political system. They need our prayers, that God will help them to maintain their desire for God's glory, and that they will work at that by meeting with Jesus. See, walking with God doesn't mean that we're isolated from the troubles and the brokenness of our world. But we do need discernment in how we engage with our world. There's a great focus in our culture among Christians today on being engaged and being involved in the brokenness, and I applaud that. We need to do that. But we also need to be discerning as we do it, so that it's done to the glory of God. So how are you going to engage with the brokenness around you this week? Maybe it's by praying for our government officials. Maybe it's by getting involved in a ministry here that reaches beyond our walls, or getting involved in something in our community that ministers to the brokenness of people. But as you do it, guard your heart by meeting with Jesus, by keeping the glory of God central in it. Because you see, a broken world cries to us to minister. But don't get absorbed by the world. Erwin Lutzer, in one of his books, tells the story of a Christian who is living in Nazi Germany. And this man told how living there and hearing the rumors of the Holocaust and what was happening to the Jews, they as believers tried to distance them from it. But there was a small railroad track that ran behind their church. And they would hear, as they gathered for worship, the train go by. And they would hear the cries of people, Jewish people, trapped in those cars being herded like cattle. And there in the brokenness, they had to decide whether to be involved or not. And here's what he writes. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew that we would hear the cries of the Jews en route to the death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the time the train was coming because the Nazi trains ran on time. And when we heard the whistle blow, we began singing hymns. By the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the top of our voices. If we heard the screams, we sang more loudly. and soon we heard them no more. Years have passed and no one talks about it anymore, but I still hear that train whistle in my sleep. God, forgive me. Forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians, yet did nothing to intervene. There is a lost world out there. They need the gospel more than anything else. But they also need us to intervene where we can in the brokenness. To be Abrams, who say, I'll take the resources that I have, and I will minister to the glory of God to broken people around me. Let's pray. So, Father, here we are, safely in our sanctuary, in our worship center. But Lord, worship is not just gathering here, and worship is not just singing hymns. Worship is also taking your name to those who are broken outside these walls. So as our Kids Hope volunteers minister this week, give them courage. As folks volunteer at the Gospel Mission, give them courage. As they work at Alternatives of Kalamazoo, as they work with child evangelism and after-school Bible programs, as we just minister to neighbors and friends and family members, Lord, give us hearts of compassion for the brokenness. And may we, as your people, stand firm for the glory of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. But may we reach out to people who are hurting around us, we pray. In our Savior's name. Amen.
Appropriate song to close. Would you stand together with me as we sing this wonderful hymn? It calls us to think of the call